We're going to start retouching this photograph, but we just want to do a couple of things before we start. I'm just going to go into Image, Image Size, and I'm going to change the size of this file. Now you don't have to change the size of your file. I'm just doing this again for the purpose of this demonstration and just as another way to look at sizing the files and as a reminder. So I'm going to come up to my dimensions and I want to make this image 15 inches in height, and I hit OK. Now it makes the image smaller on the screen because it's smaller. I'm just going to go Command 0 and increase the viewing size of that image. And we have to look at one of the key functions of Photoshop, and that is whenever you create any kind of Photoshop image or open a Photoshop file, it will always by default have a single layer, and typically it's called layer 0. You can also rename it as background layer, and we can look up in my layers tab that this is the layer that we're looking at. So this is a default way that Photoshop uses files, and in the layer menu we can create any number of layers and adjustment layers to any given photograph that we want, up to 256 different layers. So let's just look at a better view of this screen. Okay, so that's good. We can see some of the functions down here at the bottom of the layers menu. Now before I do any kind of retouching on a photograph, I want to duplicate this main layer, and the reason why I want to do that is if I start retouching the person's face and I make a really big mistake, I can reverse that mistake, but if I get too far into the image, it just becomes problematic for me to go backwards. So instead of having to go backwards, or if I really mess up the file, I want to duplicate this layer so that I always have a copy of the original photograph in that form. Now I can duplicate this layer very quickly by going Command J, and it automatically duplicates that layer. So think of layers like a deck of cards, and each card represents a different layer on top of one another. And so whatever we do to this layer may, in certain circumstances, influence what's going on the bottom layer. Now, as we start using more and more layers, we can actually change the order of these layers by dragging and dropping them, but we don't need to do that for today. One thing you should get in the habit of doing is always renaming your layers. Otherwise, it gets really confusing and disorganized if you don't rename these layers every time you make them, especially if you're working in a document with 20 different layers and you don't name them. It just becomes confusing. So I always get in the habit of renaming my layers, and I'm going to call this one Retouch because this is going to be my retouching layer. And then I'm going to take my zoom tool and just zoom in on the person's face. And the first thing that I'm going to do is come over to this tool here, which is a healing brush tool, and I'm going to select that tool. Now up in my menu, I can determine how hard or soft that brush is, and for retouching, I would pick a brush at about 70% for starters, and we can increase the size of that brush by using the right bracket key, or I can decrease it by using the left bracket key. So we can on the fly change the size of that brush. So I'm just going to find a brush size that is about the same size as the blemish, and using this tool, once again, I'm going to come over and retouch these parts on the image. And all I need to do is click on those images, and I can drag my mouse a little bit and to clean up any of these spots or areas that look like some sort of a blemish or perhaps a different color of skin. And we'll just go through this and just tidy this up a little bit. So the question with retouching is, do we remove all the characteristics of a person? Well, not necessarily. So this tool is really good for getting rid of hair. So this is, I would take the hair off the face, and we can literally just draw over the hair using this brush, and magically it gets rid of the hairs, okay? So it's a really wonderful tool to use. And I'll get rid of the one hair coming down by the eyelid there. And just some of these loose ones just up here, without making the hair look completely groomed and unnatural. It's just sort of removing some of these loose ones here. And it's good for getting rid of some of these strands of hair up here. And I'm just going to look around and see if we got any really wild hairs. Now she has very curly hair, so I'm not going to remove the hairs, but I'm going to remove some of these hairs that just are really, really big and extend quite a distance away from her head. So I'm just cleaning this up just a tiny, tiny bit without really changing the look of her hair. So. And this may seem like an arbitrary process, which in some ways it is, but it just sort of cleans that up a little bit.